My name is Gillian Caldwell, and I'm now the campaign director of One Sky, which is a new and highly collaborative national campaign here in the United States to try to pass bold federal policy to tackle the climate challenge. And I have been a lifelong human rights and humanitarian advocate really since I was about 12 years old when I started my campus chapter of Amnesty International. I've been focused on, the poorest and most marginalized people on this earth and doing what I can to empower and enable people to make a difference in their communities. And just about 2 years ago, I saw Vice President Al Gore's slideshow at the TED conference, and it was earth-shattering for me, actually, because I think I was one of the many people in this country and beyond who had been really bought into the sort of the misinformation campaign and disinformation campaign when it came to climate change. For so long, it was presented as uncertain science, and perhaps, in fact, these are natural trends of warming. And I really started connecting the dots in a way that, in fact, Gore's slideshow wasn't. But for me, I was understanding that this is, in fact, the defining challenge of our generation, particularly for those of us that care about social justice issues and humanitarian aid, and that we have to move beyond understanding it as an environmental problem and towards understanding the enormous social justice implications of the challenge and the opportunity we confront.
Fantastic. Can you just tell us what you think? I mean, is it a revolution that we need? What would make up this revolution? If this is more than just a movement, this is the biggest pressing issue we need. Then is it a revolution? Is that the solution? And if so, what would it comprise of? What would how do we get there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when you say revolution, for so many people, it concocts imagery of bloody rebellions and death and dying and hard-fought battles to achieve particular aims. And I do believe that what's needed is an absolute revolution in the way we're living our life here on planet Earth. But I don't think we're going to get where we need to go by fighting wars or even through violent means. I think the revolution that we're talking about is really a reinvention of the way in which we're living our lives. And I think that's true on many levels. I mean, first of all, take the fundamental need to re-examine the integrity with which we function in the world. We are so driven, particularly in Western cultures, towards production and marketing and distribution and consumption that we are literally depleting the resources that sustain us. We can't continue to function that way. We need to do more with less. We need to be more efficient. We need to conserve more. So every one of us at an individual level, no matter where we live, needs to really do whatever we can to reduce our so-called carbon footprint. But I think what's called for at this stage in the game is far more than that. And I will say that that's a lot. If you look at the United States, until recently, the #1 per capita carbon emitter in the world, that's a substantial responsibility when your average US citizen pumps out 40 tons of carbon a year. But we need to move beyond just personal action and making adjustments in our own personal lives and towards political engagement. Because it's not going to be enough to change the way in which we're living our lives on a personal level. We actually need not just to screw in a new light bulb, but to screw in a new politician. And the reality is that our leadership has failed us. It has been too beholden to vested interests in the fossil fuel industry, the coal industry, oil and natural gas. We need, in essence, a revolution of perception of what's expected of us as citizens in terms of engagement and interaction with the people that represent us. And if we don't get policy here in the United States, a federal cap on carbon, and strong incentives to move us towards renewable energy like wind, solar, and geothermal, we're not going to get a global deal. And December 2009 in Copenhagen is where that global deal needs to be negotiated, and we do not have time to waste. So, I mean, that's why after a lifelong dedication to the global human rights struggle, I'm focused now on US law at a federal level to set the stage for that global treaty, which I think is critical to our survival.
So as far as that, what the revolution or what this change will look like, do you feel like, us as a people and them as a political entity, like the big government bodies, do you feel confident that we're going to be able to work together to make this solution work, to make it happen? Like, I mean, you sort of have your feet in both. You've seen both sides.
I mean, what needs to be done is almost unimaginable. I mean, if you look at the scientific consensus, the leading scientific imperative would suggest that we are well past what is safe in terms of carbon loading in the atmosphere. What are we at, 385, 387 parts per million? And most leading scientists on the edge of this debate, people like Dr. James Hansen, who's on the advisory committee for OneSky, are saying we need to be back at 350 parts per million. If we're going to get back to 350 from where we are now, we're going to have to look over the next 50 years at reducing our global warming pollution by almost 100%. So you can't be glib and say, do it, we've got to do it. This is a preposterous crisis, of course we're going to do it. Doing it is not simple. I mean, doing it is really deep. So there's not a day that doesn't go by when I wonder, and I'm sure all of us working on this issue wonder if we're going to do it. Because it's almost impossible to imagine how we make 100% turnaround in our use and abuse of energy and energy sources. But at the same time, I think, just as we as a species, we human beings are capable of remarkable excess and remarkable destructive capacity, we have ingenuity and we have commitment and we have perseverance and we have collective potential that is unparalleled as a species. So I feel like this moment of crisis, as Einstein would say, is a terrible moment to waste. I mean, a moment of crisis is a moment of deep and abiding opportunity for us. And if there's ever been a time to reinvent who and how we are, it's now. And I don't think that the answers just lie in the technologies. I mean, when we're talking about wind and solar, I mean, the wind and the sun are not technologies. What is required, though, is a technical infrastructure to distribute that technology to places around the country and around the planet that don't generate enough energy through wind and solar energy. So on some level, it's a combination of those really low-tech solutions, which have to do with how we use less and live in closer community, and draw more on the local resources that surround us and live in a less globalized way, if you will. And in another sense, we have to tap, the resources of technology that can help us get where we need to go.
So looking at those systems that you're talking about and localization and these kinds of changes that are going to have to take place, like, can you try and paint the picture of what you think, what is the ideal spot, that sweet spot that we need to get to? What is that, if it is a revolution, and once we, if we do achieve the success that we want to fight for, what does it look like to you, if you could paint that picture?
So the question is, what's a utopia when it comes to, a world in which we're not headed towards Armageddon?
But yeah, well, where would you want your kids to live when they're your age? Like, where would be the perfect place? How would you describe that?
Well, I think, we, and by we now, I mean those of us that live in, in contemporary society, in the midst of abundant technology and industrial resources, and in a very fast-paced and highly networked environment, are craving a return to a sense of community and to a sense of belonging and shared values and shared tradition and shared resources. And so you start to see, I think now, bubbling up from the so-called development, the developed world, a lot of communities that rely on traditions of bartering and sharing and growing and sustaining food. I mean, I moved from Brooklyn, New York to Tacoma Park, Maryland, where I'm to be the proud owner of 3 chickens and a small garden in my backyard. And I've taken a no new stuff oath for 2009. And a lot of people say, well, that's not going to help the economy. I mean, we're headed into a recession, and if we don't continue to consume, if we don't continue to buy things, we're just going to get deeper into the trenches. But the reality is it's this overconsumption and overproduction and overdistribution that's destroying us. And so the point of a no new stuff oath for me and my family, and by no new stuff what we mean is that nothing that isn't consumable. So, I mean, we will purchase the food and drinks that we need to survive, but we'll draw as much as we can on local resources, grow as much as we can in our garden, and get as many eggs as we can from our 3 chickens, and we'll defer when it comes to anything else. No new socks or sweaters or CDs or lamps or rugs, because we don't need them. And if we do, I'll send an email out on my listserv, as I did the other day, because my daughter lost her winter coat, to say, does anybody have a winter coat hanging around, because we lost one. And I think that's part of a way forward. It's not just about reducing our dependence on production and consumption, but about increasing our sense of connectedness at a community level.
And that change that you've been able to implement into your life, it's that's a big step to make for someone in our society to make that decision, especially with their family. And so what do you think it is that mental block that people have when you've had the epiphany in your life? You realized a year ago that you wanted to take a new path in life, and so many people here at Power Shift have had that experience, and we're all in the same boat, but there's so many people out there in the world that haven't had that change. What do you think it is that's that psychological block? Why is it that we still we know what the solution is, but we aren't able to go and act it out every day the way we should?
Well, I think the challenge is that the threat we're facing when it comes to the climate is invisible to most people most of the time. It's not really of so much concern to somebody living in the South Bronx that the Arctic ice cap is melting and that polar bears are drowning. What they're concerned about is putting food on the table. So, that's why Green for All and the work, our allies at Green for All and Van Jones has done is so important, because it's about talking about the economic opportunity and potential of a green energy revolution, and ensuring that the society we reinvent is not built on the same fabric and framework as the flawed system we just emerged from. The failure to monetize carbon was the biggest failure in the market history of capitalism. Nobody's internalizing their externalities, and that's why we're in the problem that we're in right now. But I think you have to bring it home. It has to be local. My uncle's a sugar maker in Vermont, and he knows that because of the warming planet, he's not able to generate as much maple syrup from the maple trees in his neighborhood. And there are so many people all over the country and all over the world who are seeing the very direct impacts of a warming planet. And so I think part of our job as advocates is to try to bring it home and to try to make it local and make it real to people, so they understand what will become even more obvious as every year passes, which is that we're facing a catastrophe and an enormous opportunity if we embrace it soon enough.
So, looking at the financial crisis that we're at right now, what do you think in parallels are, if there are, between the environmental crisis and the financial crisis? What are the parallels, if any? Have you seen similarities in the solutions?
Well, I think President Obama has really connected the dots in a way that no other leader in recent history has done for the American people. He has connected the dots between the economic crisis, the energy crisis, and our national security crisis. And he understands that those are interdependent crises, that if we continue to rely on fossil fuels, which are limited resources, we will be in wars in the Middle East. That if we continue to function as we have, we will jeopardize our national security, because as the Pentagon has indicated, climate change and the associated eco-refugees, of which there could be 650 million in the near term, is one of the biggest national security threats that the United States will confront. And Obama has recognized as well that the economic crisis we face right now is one born in large part from our dependence on finite fossil fuels and a supply chain that is dwindling and that exists in many instances outside these United States. So it's not just that we're relying on fuels that are in increasingly short supply, but that we're laggards in terms of understanding the economic potential of the technologies we need to be developing to move forward into a 21st century economy. We're not producing windmills and solar panels. We're importing them from other places around the world. So a lot of the language the president uses to describe this is about bringing it home, creating new jobs here in America. I have to say, frankly, it goes against my very internationalist orientation to talk in that way, to think about energy independence and to think about good jobs here at home, which isn't to say I'm unpatriotic, and I know the president's been accused, and his wife, of being unpatriotic, but it is to say I also appreciate it when he looks at things through a very global lens. And the reality is that, again, to get a global deal, we're going to need to make investments in avoided deforestation at a global level and in advancing these technologies and exporting and enabling these technologies to thrive in developing countries as well.
So if you were to put your finger on the most immediate threat to humans right now, is it climate change or is it something else? Or what would you say is the number one thing?
Well, I mean, if you ask me what the most immediate threat is, my answer would probably be different than if you asked me what the most important or significant threat is. And I do believe the most important and significant threat confronting humans on planet Earth right now is climate change. And that's because of the ways in which it connects to so many other problems which are already in the making and before us. Take a look at the crises over water, for example. I mean, we are going to be seeing increasing instability, escalating to violent conflict over water supplies in the near term. Take a look at drought and famine and at some of the ways in which that's ravaged parts of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Africa, which are seeing global warming increases in temperature. Take a look at the vectoral spread of diseases carried by mosquitoes that couldn't exist in the cooler temperatures that we had in the countries from which they're surfacing now. So there are many health and economically related challenges which are emerging from global warming or climate change, which aren't often connected to it.
So if climate change, and if that is the most important issue, but we're not getting this response quick enough from people, like that is, I agree with you, that is the most important thing. But in trying to trigger that thing inside of people to make people act and stand up and call it a revolution or a movement, whatever you want to call it. Is there anything else that we could try and maybe point out more easily, or to try and trigger within people if they're not getting the climate message because it's people are in the Bronx and the issues are being most experienced in the Arctic. What can we use to try and trigger people if they're not getting, the masses aren't getting it, that it is climate change?
Well, I think, what the polling would indicate, if you take a look at the U.S. audience, for example, is that a majority of people in this country know and understand that climate change is a serious problem and that it demands a serious response. There's still a small fraction of people, maybe 30 to 35% of this country, that don't think it's a problem, that are of the opinion that it's been manufactured by climate alarmists, or that don't really think it rises to the level of significance of some other problems. So I think we've made some very good headway, and the reality is that with a mere 30 to 35% of this country active on this issue, we could get where we need to go when it comes to political leadership. At the same time, what the polls would also suggest is that it is not motivating people to bludgeon them over the head with the catastrophic consequences looming. All they get all day long in a media-saturated environment is a cacophony of images coming at them. This problem and that problem, and everything's urgent and everything's a disaster. So what the polling suggests is that people want to hear about solutions. They want to understand how to resolve the problems, not what's broken, but how to fix it. And I have to say that, I like to ignore that polling because I believe that people need both a little bit more awareness of the very serious challenge we're confronting, and a belief that they can make a difference. So I do believe that you need to have that blend, that mix of the challenge or the crisis alongside the solution to motivate people. But the biggest problem I think we face in communicating this is that every audience is motivated by a different dimension of the problem. The problem has so many facets and so many faces that you can't take one cookie-cutter approach to mobilize. For some people, a drowning polar bear is very motivating. And for others, a child in an emergency room facing asthma because of particulate matter in the atmosphere is motivating. And for others, somebody struck by famine in sub-Saharan Africa is motivating. So I think what we need is a proliferation of narratives, of vignettes, of moving human stories where we start to put together a mosaic, a picture of all of the impacts of this, and start to get out of our compartments and our misperception that this is an environmental problem, and towards a comprehensive understanding that this is game-changing at a global level right now.
Yeah, like when you speak about like that mosaic that you need to try and wrap everyone in, you're right, that's sort of a sweet spot that we deal with as filmmakers, is trying to put together a message that as many people in the audience can connect with. It's sort of a never-ending battle, but that's what we're trying to achieve in this film. What do you think is the best vehicle? Do you think that films are the best? Is it using the massive online capabilities now? I mean, what's the best way that you think we can reach people?
Well, I mean, I think you have to think, in a multi-platform way about, communications. I think certainly online media, thinking about, snackable media for cell phone-based distribution, text messaging, the internet, radio, print. I mean, I think, any successful campaign is going to need to think about how it conveys itself in multiple mediums, because, again, you reach different audiences and different demographics through different media.
Thank you. Go ahead.
You mentioned something interesting, because...
May I ask you guys this question?
Yes.
You've said something interesting in contrast to a number of the interviews that we've already done so far. And one of the things that we're getting often is this idea of personal sacrifice versus politics. But you said exactly the opposite. You said we have to have less personal sacrifice and more of a political shift, if I read you correctly earlier. What would be the change in our political landscape that needs to happen to make this come to fruition, if we can do it at all?
Well, to be clear, I'm not suggesting less personal sacrifice. I think not enough of us are really taking personal responsibility and accountability for our carbon footprint and for the ways in which our own individual behavior is contributing to the problem. So I strongly urge and encourage very significant adjustments in how we're living our lives. We're not going to get there without it. But what I do believe is that alone is not enough. Even if everybody completely reconceived how they were living their lives, we would not get where we needed to go, because the reductions we need to make in global warming pollution are so dramatic. And so what we need is an environment in which those reductions are mandated and required and monitored and assessed and evaluated. And that requires federal policy. And that requires a change in the system, in the whole economic system in which we're living, in which carbon or global warming pollution is no longer free. It's no longer free to pollute. You have to pay to pollute. So if you create disincentives for pollution, you create incentives for non-polluting sources of energy, like wind and solar and geothermal. And I think, here in the United States, our President Obama and his campaign, I think, reinvigorated a nation and a sense of national service and commitment and engagement, and a sense that we can be the change we seek. I mean, when he accepted the Democratic nomination for the presidency, he said, "I am not the change you seek." Right? For so many people see him as this charismatic figure. He said, "I am not the change you seek. You are the ones that need to create the change we need. And so I think that is that central mantra, and the way in which she was elected, the tremendous volunteer network and the infrastructure that was built to support and sustain his candidacy, and the values that underlie that candidacy, which were about respect and inclusion and diversity and empowerment, creates an enormous opportunity for political engagement. And by that I mean not just voting. I mean, in this country, half the people who are registered to vote don't vote on election day, whether it's a primary or a general election. I lived and worked in South Africa under apartheid, and I can tell you when blacks got the right to vote in South Africa, they waited for days online to do so. So it is a privilege, and I don't want to dismiss the significance of voting. I mean, youth, if you look at Power Shift and Power Vote, youth helped put this president and this Congress in office. So voting is part of it, but it goes way beyond voting. It's actively engaging the people who are paid to represent you to ensure that they deserve your vote and your respect and your encouragement. And you need to let them know when they don't. Because the way it stands right now in this country, it's not one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. So politicians listen to the votes and they listen to the dollars. And if the votes aren't talking up, money's talking. And when we're talking about a climate campaign at One Sky, we've got 350 allied organizations, 30 organizers in 20 states. And after this weekend, I hope thousands of volunteer climate precinct captains and Power Shift leaders all over the country. Meanwhile, ExxonMobil has 500 paid lobbyists working Washington, D.C. So it is not insignificant, the odds we're up against right now, and it requires more than voting.
Yeah, you've actually already mentioned something about this youth movement, because previously...
Sorry, I might just go remind me to try to be well.
The youth movements have been very disenfranchised in the past. And again, in the film, we're trying to get at the notion about how we can start a youth revolution, or evolution if you want to call it that. Something that allows them the power that they required in the past that they never may have gotten, because this is the last chance we're going to get. Can you speak to that at all?
Can you rephrase it, what the question? It's about youth being disempowered in the past and now?
Well, yeah, because we're asking the question, how do we build this revolution? How do we build this movement? In the past, a youth conference like this, I don't think would even have happened had a Republican been elected. I think you would have seen something very different in terms of the attendance at a conference like this. So you've already explained a number of things politically that have to happen for the youth to be able to get involved. Are there any other conditions? Is there anything else that you see that would be the precepts to start this, the momentum required to actually see this through?
It's funny, I was just thinking that same question, like, how do we, when you spoke last night, and Van Jones as well, I'll just tell you, you guys were my two favorite speakers, and you just live it. The energy when you talk is so amazing, and you just can't help but be connected to it. And Van Jones reminded me of these big, amazing speakers that we were looking up to, and what is it that makes those people? And how can we give that to these youth? All these kids are here so fired up.
Yeah.
How do we convince them that they have that in them?
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth noting that every youth registered at this conference has a badge which says leader on it. My badge says production. I'm a little insulted. I like to think of myself as a leader, but that sends a very strong signal to youth here this weekend, which is that you're a leader, whether you know it or not. And the whole purpose of this conference is to empower and enable better leadership from youth. And so, I was struck because I've got several youth from Oberlin College staying in my house here, never met them before, came on through a listserv, and I was driving them down here today. I heard them talking in the back seat, and one of them said, well, what's the difference between a workshop and a panel? And I realized these, some of these youth are youth that have never even been to a conference. Otherwise, they would know the difference between a workshop and a panel. So some of them are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, wild-eyed, just wondering what this is all about. And many others of them are highly sophisticated organizers who have been working, in some cases, for 8 or 9 years as organizers in their communities. So I think for sure, one of the preconditions to youth engagement is a supportive network and a sense of community and training and empowerment to enable them to lead, because everybody has the inherent capacity to be a leader. That's really important. What's also important is inspirational stories and people who are leading and who can demonstrate and inspire good leadership. And good leadership, by the way, is not just telling people what to do, when, where, and how, but modeling and enabling other leadership to flourish. So that's really critically important. And then education is so important. I mean, I think young people today are motivated and activated on this issue because they've been educated, because they now understand that it is one of the most pressing issues of our time. And An Inconvenient Truth played an enormous role, which was the film which featured Al Gore's slideshow, played an enormously important role in educating and activating people around this issue. So I think there's a lot of key ingredients to a youth-enabled movement for change, but those are some of them, the inspiration, the education, and the training and the infrastructure to support and enable that power.
How would you integrate or bring into the fold to confront this issue of climate change the people that might be termed the opposition in some way? How are we going to make this inclusive? How do we bring them in the fold?
Well, I think as Van Jones said last night, this movement includes coal miners too. And it is important to understand that people working the mines are people who have been, in many cases, very seriously impacted, and negatively so, by the very challenges we're talking about when it comes to climate change. These are people whose health is on the line, who suffer from lung cancer, whose communities are literally covered in coal ash. If you look at the coal ash disaster in Tennessee, took place on December 22nd, just a few days before Christmas, a disaster more than 100 times the size of the Exxon Valdez spill. The reality is that the communities that we so often point the finger to and at are the communities that are struggling in the context of this fossil fuel dependent machinery. What we need to do is envision a world together where those people are given the training and support they need to transition into other lucrative forms of work. It's a little bit tougher when we think about very well-heeled corporate executives who are profiting, and as we're aware, many times in the billions of dollars on an annual basis from oil and coal. The reality is we can't get where we need to go without a lot of business interests at stake as well. One of the things we're doing at One Sky is underwriting the work of a group called Ceres, which is focused on bringing a business coalition together to call for a strong cap on carbon and an end to coal-fired power plants that emit global warming pollution. So when you start to hear about it from Starbucks and Whole Foods and other key companies with brand names, then you think about it a little differently. I don't think we're going to be able to convince Congress just with the force and power and potency of America's youth. They want to hear from the insurance adjusters that know very well that the entire insurance industry is at risk. They want to hear from the bankers, and they want to hear from the businessmen who say, give me a stable price on carbon, give me a market signal so I know how to plan for my future here.